Hello and welcome to BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS. Before we begin today's session of the comprehensive news analysis, an important announcement. BYJU'S is bringing to you the National Scholarship Test that gives you a chance to win up to 90% scholarship on the BYJU'S Exam Prep IAS courses. This online test will be held on 20th of March at 11 a.m. The link to register for the test is given in the description of this video. Do register and test how much are you prepared for the upcoming examination. Now, the first article that we have for you focuses on the patent rights issue for the COVID-19 vaccines. Now, the background story is that a few months back, India and South Africa collectively proposed in the WTO that around the world, whatever vaccines are being produced, they should not get any patents. For instance, when a company produces a vaccine, it requires a lot of investment, a lot of money. For example, for making a new vaccine or making a new medicine, you would have to test your composition, you would have to conduct a lot of trials, you would have to take permissions, many of your attempts would result into failure, and finally, after a lot of time, you might get a successful vaccine or a medicine. Means to get the successful formula and the technology to make a vaccine would require billions of dollars to be spent by the pharma companies. That is why the pharma companies don't want their process or their composition to be copied, and that is why they ask for their intellectual property rights or the patent to be given to them. However, because the COVID-19 vaccine is something that every person in the entire world requires, in the poorest of the poor nations and in the richest of the richest nations, there has been this demand from nations such as India and South Africa that the pharma companies should not be allowed to patent their composition or their manufacturing process for the vaccines, so that even the companies in poor or developing nations can copy that formula. They can also make those vaccines and they can make that available to the people who can't afford vaccines that are priced at a higher price. Now, initially when India and South Africa proposed this in the WTO, EU, that is the European Union, and US also to a certain extent did not really favor this, because most of these pharma companies had actually made these vaccines first around the world were in EU or in US. They wanted a good return on their investment, and that is why they forced their governments not to accept this proposal. But now it seems that the European Union is open to this particular proposal, and they are of the view that the patent rights given to these pharma companies can be relaxed for up to 5 years. So for 5 years, we might allow the companies in the developing nation and in the poor nations also to make these vaccines without fearing that they are copying a patented vaccine from any other country. Interestingly, this patent waiver will not apply to the drugs, that is the medicines that are being made by many of these countries, and also it would not cover the diagnostic devices. So this patent waiver is specifically only for the COVID-19 vaccines and not anything else related to the COVID-19 disease. India's initial demand, in fact, was to waive the IPR, that is intellectual property rights, on COVID therapeutics. Now, therapeutics include the drugs and the medicines that are being given to the COVID patients as well. But EU has only supported the vaccine-related demand and nothing related to the medicines as such. This waiver, as I said, will allow the pharma companies in developing nations to produce vaccine in much larger numbers at a much lower price point, which will allow them to export the vaccines to even those nations which can't afford a very high cost vaccine right now. The reason why it was important for EU to support it, that WTO works in such a manner that every decision of the WTO has to be unanimous. So even if one single nation says that no, we don't support this resolution, it would not be considered as passed officially. So every single member state would have to support this resolution in order for this to be accepted. Now, this is still in the discussion stage, but the experts who have read the text say that these waivers would only apply to developing nations that have not exported more than 10% of the COVID-19 doses in 2021. So it's still not clear if it would cover India as well. Means we still don't know if Indian companies would be allowed to make vaccines that are protected under patent by other companies. So there is still a lack of clarity on that regard for now. Also, the provisions are only applicable to patented products as such. So vaccines that are made by Moderna, Pfizer, etc., they have not patented their vaccine in India anyway. These vaccines are not available in India. So we might not see these vaccines being produced in India even if this resolution is passed in the WTO. From the Indian point of view, we right now have enough stock of the vaccines to cover as many people who want to get their shots. However, to cover the future generation, the problem that we have is not with the patent waivers. We are more worried about the supply lines. So, for instance, we know how to make the vaccine, we know the technology behind it, but the problem is that the components that we require, the raw material that we require for these vaccines are not produced in India. We have to import them from Western nations or China, and that is becoming problematic because the supply chains are not really open. If you remember earlier on when COVID had started, the US president had banned the export of anything which was related to COVID-19 cure to be exported to any other nation. So the supply chain was disrupted starting at the US itself. That is why the Indian government and the Indian manufacturers are more worried about the Western countries not allowing enough export of the input materials that we require for the vaccine, and we are not really worried about the patent waiver as of now. Now, in this article, you would also read a phrase that is called compulsory licensing. I'm sure you would have heard this phrase even earlier as well. Now, what is compulsory licensing? In very simple terms, let's take an example. Let's assume that there's a company that has produced a medicine that will be able to cure cancer or that will be able to cure diseases such as AIDS or Ebola, etc. Now, obviously, it will be patented because they have spent a lot of dollars in building that, so they would want to earn a lot of profit. For example, these companies sell their medicine in India at rupees 5 lakh per dose. Now, when these companies sell this medicine at rupees 5 lakh per dose, that means very few people in India would be able to afford it. But if it is a disease that is widespread in India, then it is the government of India's responsibility to safeguard these people of India. So the government of India has an option called compulsory licensing, under which the government can license a third party, means any manufacturer in India can be allowed by the government of India to copy this product of a foreign company even if it is protected under the patent. It does not require the consent of the patent owners. Now, anytime after the 3 years from the date of sealing of the patent, this compulsory licensing thing can be done. However, this compulsory licensing thing should only be done if there is an urgent requirement by a large enough public for that drug or medicine to be used. The problem is that many pharma companies around the world say that Indian government actually misuses this kind of a law. There are some medicines in India which have been allowed by the Indian government to be produced by many Indian pharma companies even if they are patented, because Indian government says that we are saving the life of our people and we are doing this under compulsory licensing. The problem is, if the original company was selling this medicine at rupees 5 lakh per dose, the other company which will make the medicine under the Indian government's permission might sell this at only rupees 1000 rupees per dose. So obviously people will buy medicine from this third company only. Now this company which has been allowed to make the medicine without the consent of the original company will have to pay a part of its profit to the original company. But if you can actually see, there is such a price difference that it doesn't really matter how much profit they pay to the original patent holder, that will never suffice them for the profits that they are losing here. The reason why many companies say that Indian government is misusing the compulsory licensing provision is that the TRIPS agreement, that is the trade related aspects of intellectual property rights, does not specifically list the reasons that can be used by the government for compulsory licensing. Although the Doha Declaration says that countries are free to determine the grounds for using compulsory licensing and the pharma companies cannot question that. If you want to read more about it, the Indian government actually gave the first ever compulsory license in March 2012. This license was given to a Hyderabad based company called the Natco Pharma, and they were allowed to produce an anti-cancer drug which was called Nexavar. This anti-cancer drug was used in the treatment of liver and kidney. This was originally produced by a pharma company called Bayer, which was obviously not happy because their permission was not taken, and the Indian government allowed the Natco Pharma of India to produce this so that the cost can be reduced for the end patient. Also, the IPR waiver for the COVID-19 vaccine is not really a topic that has come in the news for the first time. As I said, the demand for IP waiver for the COVID-19 vaccine was first made by India and South Africa collectively. mainly because they wanted the vaccines to be produced at a much larger scale throughout the world. Now, obviously, the pharma companies don't support this because this would cut down on their profit immensely. The pharma companies, in fact, say that if we eliminate the IP protection and allow the other companies also to make this medicine, that will degrade the quality of the vaccines because we don't know what exactly is the manufacturing process. We don't know if they are able to control the quality or not. So just by saying that we are allowing the other companies to make the vaccine doesn't mean that the best quality vaccine will be made. So it would just compromise our response to COVID pandemic. Not just this, people such as Bill Gates also have opposed this idea. Bill Gates said that the problem with the COVID-19 vaccine program is not the intellectual property rights. It is that the vaccine factories may not be able to comply with the quality that is required. We need the vaccines to be 100% safe, and for that, only the most trusted vaccine manufacturers should be allowed to make this vaccine. So, just by taking away the IPR rights, we can't really expect the vaccines to be magically produced throughout the world at a very low cost. There are other roadblocks also that are stopping the developing nations and the low income nations from producing vaccines at a much larger scale. There are trade barriers, there are supply chain issues, as I said earlier, that the input material or the raw material required for the vaccines is not being supplied willfully by Western nations and the other European nations. Apart from this, nations such as US earlier had blocked the export of critical raw material for production of the COVID-19 vaccines, and that is why we see that the poorer nations across the world are still lagging behind when it comes to the vaccine coverage for COVID-19 amongst their population. The next article focuses on a similar topic that we discussed yesterday. That is the need to build a circular economy if we have to handle the waste that is being generated by solar power generation and by other renewable sources of energy. The reason why we are discussing a similar topic consecutive days is because while the last article yesterday only talked about the problem that we will be facing in the future with the generation of solar power waste, this article specifically gives concrete steps to ensure that we can build a circular economy in the coming years. So we would like to focus on those steps given by the author here. The author here mentioned that in the budget speech this year, the government emphasized on the role of using cleaner technology such as solar power and batteries in order to drive India's economic growth in the coming decades. Now, as per the International Renewable Energy Agency, India, as a result of giving a push to its solar power, would generate a lot of solar waste as well. Exactly the same thing that we studied in the last article yesterday as well. The author here says that the way out of this problem is to develop a circular economy. Now, in simple terms, circular economy means that when you have used an equipment till the end of its life, a lot of components from that equipment can then be used in some other sector or in some other industry. Thus, building a circular model where you don't have to discard the entire equipment and the entire input that you have used in any of those equipments. The author here gives a 6-step formula one by one to build a circular economy in the country. First step is to revise the existing electronic waste management rules that we have in place right now. Because right now, there is no clear responsibility on who is responsible for recycling the solar waste that is being produced by the use of solar power plants and the use of solar panels. The author says that there is a need to define exact responsibility on the various stakeholders. Not just this, give them annual targets and see if they are being achieved or not, and then we can incentivize or punish these stakeholders accordingly. The second step would be to avoid dumping and burning of these components. See, a lot of components that are used in solar panels have semiconductors and rare earth elements that can be harmful to the environment and even poisonous in nature. Right now, most of the solar power waste that we are producing is being landfilled because that is the cheapest and the most common practice to get rid of such waste. That has to be stopped and there has to be a strict law against that. The renewable energy industry also should increase its investment in the research and development of this technology. Recycling involves a lot of steps, including dismantling, disassembly of the equipment, extracting whatever is useful from that, and then using it in a new equipment. That requires a lot of research and development and skill development as well. The fourth step is to create innovative financing routes, because again, as we discussed yesterday, setting up solar panels or setting up waste management and recycling facility requires a lot of money and investment. Since that is not really seen as a big problem right now, there is no clear financing route for this. The central government should step in and nudge the public and the private sector banks to charge lower rate of interest for loans that are required for setting up such facilities. The next step is to improve the product design and quality to make sure that if we are extracting something from an equipment that has lived for 15, 20, 25 years, there are still some components that can still be used in the new equipments altogether. Also, we should try to find substitute for toxic metals such as cadmium, lead, etc. so that even if they end up in a landfill, they are not as harmful to environment as they used to be. The sixth step is that the union and the state governments must also set quality control standards, especially when they are the ones who are giving tenders. Let's take an example that the central government decides that on all the government owned buildings in Delhi or across the country, they want solar panels to be set up on the rooftop so that the electricity can be generated. So they give a tender to a company to manufacture these solar panels and then install them at the rooftop. Now, in such tenders, which can be crores and crores of rupees, the central and the state governments must put stringent conditions that high quality material only should be used, which should not harm the environment in the long run. All these steps can ensure that we end up with a circular economy and we can handle this problem that we will face in the near future. To understand circular economy better, these are the important aspects of it. It involves the practice of reducing environmental footprint, increased income by using the materials that we regard as waste, reduce the dependency on the resources, and minimize the waste material that is produced. If all these steps are put into action, we will have a circular economy at our hand very soon. Let me give you an example of a government policy that was introduced a few years back, which is a very good example of how a circular economy can be built. The government of India introduced a vehicle scrappage policy. In simple terms, if you are going ahead and buying a new car, the government said that first exchange it with your old car, sell it in the scrap, and as a result of it, you will get a good discount on your new car that you are willing to buy. For instance, the incentive to be given to the vehicle owners included 4 to 6% of discount on the ex-showroom price of the new vehicle, tax rebate in multiple states of up to 25% on the road tax, additional discounts on the new vehicles, and also a waiver of the registration fee that you have to pay for the new vehicle. All of this ensures that when you're buying a new vehicle, you're first giving away your old one. So there's not an exponential increase in the number of vehicles on the roads, and the components that are still usable from your old vehicle can be taken out and they can be used in making new vehicles. That is a good example of how a circular economy can be put into place. The next article that we have focuses on the rights of people with disabilities and how our education system specifically is very unfavorable to these people. The authors say that the Rights of People with Disability Act of 2016 guaranteed a lot of things for disabled people. They guaranteed multiple rights and entitlements. However, 6 years down the line, most of it has still remained on paper, which could be seen recently through a Supreme Court case. In 2021, the Supreme Court gave the judgment in the Avni Prakash versus the NTA case. In this case, the student's answer book was snatched by the examiner and the student did not get the extra hour of time that they are legally entitled to under this particular act. The examiner himself was not aware of this provision, which highlights the lack of awareness that we have even in the people who are a part of this entire system. This is a prime example of the laws being made on paper but not being translated on the ground in real life. Another example is the recently released Draft Accessibility Guidelines and Standard for Higher Education Institution. These are a set of guidelines that have to be followed by higher education institutions as per the UGC. Now, these guidelines, as with many other documents, are extremely ambitious. They talk about a number of rights and entitlements to be given to people with disabilities, but even the draft document that has come out is not accessible to people with visual disability. So little thought has been put to it that the policy which specifically targets a certain group of people those people themselves would not be able to read the policy. This again proves the fact that the people who are making and drafting these rules are not really aware of the ground situation. These guidelines and suggestions look great on the paper, but there are a number of changes that are required on ground. For example, each of these guidelines should be followed with a checklist that tells us what actions exactly have been taken by these institutions. Also, since guidelines are just suggestions and ideas that are given by the UGC to the higher education institutions, the UGC right now cannot take any action even if these institutions don't follow these guidelines. This also needs to change. The UGC should be empowered to take disciplinary action against those higher education institutions who are not following these guidelines. Only then there will be some seriousness with regards to these guidelines being given to the higher education institutions. In order to ensure that these guidelines are followed, we must also have a regular assessment of what are the requirements of people with disabilities who are studying in such institutions. It should be the responsibility of these higher education institutions to ensure that whenever a disabled person joins their institution, they should conduct an assessment of what are the problems that they are facing and what are the requirements. Would they need a certain support system, and ensure that those support systems are provided to them at their place of residence. It may be hostels or at the place where they are attending the classes, because it is our responsibility to make them a part of our society as much as we are. These guidelines should also provide redressal mechanism. Means if the people with disability have an issue, if they are not given the rights and entitlements that are given to them, then where should they approach? Where should they complain? There should be a mobile number or an email ID that has to be provided to them if we have to make sure that this law actually translates on the ground. Now, this article starts itself with a mention of the Rights of People with Disability Act of 2016. So it's important to discuss the important provisions regarding that act. This act of 2016 introduced a lot of positive changes in the lives of the people with disability. For instance, the number of disabilities that are recognized by the government increased from 7 to 21. Now, even having mental illness, autism, cerebral palsy, chronic neurological conditions, etc., are considered as a part of disability, and thus people suffering from these problems will also be given the benefits under the law. Not just this, the government has also been authorized to notify any other category of specified disability to be given benefits under this act. The law also increases reservation for people suffering from disability from 3% to 4% in the government jobs and 3 to 5% in the higher education institutions across the country. People from this group, that is people suffering from disability, between the age of 6 and 18 years shall have the right to free education. So for them, the RTE law applies till the age of 18 and not just till the age of 14. The government has empowered the Chief Commissioner for Persons with Disabilities and State Commissioners to act as regulatory bodies and to act as the places for grievance redressal with regards to provisions given under this act. At the global level also, the UN has adopted the United Nations Convention on the Rights of Persons with Disability in 2006. It came into force in May 2008 and asked the member nations to make sure that they have policies, laws and measures for securing the rights which are recognized in this convention, and also make sure that any laws and regulations which are discriminatory to these people are taken away in the due course of time. The Government of India also launched the Accessible India campaign, which is a nationwide campaign under Department of Empowerment of People with Disabilities, Ministry of Social Justice and Empowerment. This campaign aims at making a barrier-free and conducive environment for all the Divyangjans across the country. This is the time when the Prime Minister of India made a call that people with disability should be called Divyang and not Viklang. Next, we have an article that talks about the increasing power of the Chinese Yuan and the fact that it may be used as a reference currency for interim oil trade between India and Russia at the time of the war, when Russia is facing increasing sanctions from the Western nations. The article says that because Russia is offering crude oil to India at discounted prices, India is tempted to take up on that offer. But the problem is, so far, the trade between the two countries used to be in US dollar. But now that there are increasing sanctions being imposed on Russia, Russia is not looking forward to trade in US dollar, and there has to be another currency that has to be found. Now, one option can be that India can pay Russia in Indian rupees. But the problem is, since Russia does not buy a lot of stuff from India, where will they use the Indian rupee? Because it does not have as much acceptability in the international market as dollar or euro or pound have. The solution here can be the Chinese yuan, since it is a currency that is increasingly being accepted throughout the world and will also suit the interests of Russia as well as China. Now, you should know that out of all the sanctions that have been imposed on Russia, the Russian energy exports have not specifically been banned. It is only the US that has announced that we will not be importing any Russian oil and gas. There are certain Russian banks that have been removed from the SWIFT payment system, and the foreign reserves of the Russian central bank have also been frozen. And that is why there is a need for Russia that if they have to continue their international trade, they have to find an alternative to the US dollar. Now, as I said, mostly the international trade happens in the US dollar because it is the most acceptable currency throughout the world. And when you are trading with some other country, you only want that currency that can be used in other parts of the world, which gives a lot of power to the US. Because the US government knows that it is their currency which is used as a reserve currency throughout the world, they have the power to freeze dollars, and thus they are the first country usually to announce that we are imposing sanctions because they know that they control the world's reserve currency, which gives them immense power. That is what China has been trying to challenge in the past few years. In fact, ever since China has increased its export exponentially in the past couple of decades, they have also been trying to ensure that yuan is used by as many nations as possible and it becomes the alternate reserve currency throughout the world. Although they have made progress in this, but the fact remains that even today, only 3% of global trade is done in Chinese yuan, while almost 90% of global trade is still happening in US dollars only. So there is still no comparison between the two. Now, in between India and Russia, it's not a certainty that Chinese yuan will be used for bilateral trade. This is just an idea that has been floated around. It may happen that the Indian government might not accept this because of our ongoing situation with China specifically, and we would not want to depend on the Chinese currency anyway. So it remains to be seen what exactly will be the solution if India and China really have to continue their trade, specifically if India is looking to increase its crude oil import from the Russian country at a discounted price. Now, the efforts made by China to make yuan a global currency have been noticed by everyone throughout the world in the past few years. This is because this is the next big step of the Chinese economics growth story. They want their currency to become a global currency. Now, if it does happen, it will give a lot of benefits to China. For example, the Chinese exporters would be able to buy money at much lower cost. Not just this, yuan will be used for international contracts. That means that a lot of Chinese exports, which right now are dependent on the dollar value, will not have to worry about what is the exchange rate of dollar right now because they will be priced in Chinese yuan only. Other countries' central banks will also try to hold yuan as a part of their foreign exchange reserve. That will give China all the more power to impose sanctions and control the economy of other countries as well. Now, China has seen a lot of success in this regard. For example, in December 2015, IMF announced that yuan is now given a status of a reserve currency. In October 2016, IMF made yuan a part of SDR, that is a special drawing rights, which is a currency basket used by the IMF to give loan to the member nations. In fact, in August 2015, the Chinese yuan became the fourth most used currency in the entire world. So it is fast surpassing the other currencies across the world, that is the Japanese yen, the Canadian loonie and the Australian dollar, but it is still far behind the US dollar as of now. The Chinese leaders, on the other hand, are trying to encourage traders in other nations also, such as Canada, Singapore, Australia and America, to trade in Chinese yuan, saying that they don't have to worry about the volatility, and whenever they have to exchange it for any commodity or any other currency, the Chinese central bank will always be open to them. The next article is about a statement made by the Union Road and Highways Minister, Shri Nitin Gadkari, in the Parliament, where he said that the sales of electric vehicle will rise by 10 times by the end of the ongoing year, that is 2022, which is an extremely encouraging sign. The minister said that between 2019-20 and 2020-21, the sale of two-wheeler electric vehicles rose by 422%, while the sale of four-wheelers increased by 230% in the same time period. As of 2021, the number of electric vehicles registered in India are over 3,24,000, which are about 1.7% of all the vehicles registered in the country. In the coming years, India would have to exponentially increase its dependence on EVs because, as per the minister, if the current trend continues, our import bill of crude oil will go extremely high. Right now, it is about 8 lakh crore rupees, and it will go on to touch 25 lakh crore rupees if our dependence on petrol and diesel automobiles keeps on increasing. Thus, as a country together, we have to find alternative sources of energy. One of them can be using hydrogen. The minister said that hydrogen is the fuel of the future, and thus we have to work towards it. Although there are some problems such as the high cost of battery, lack of skills, the lack of initiatives taken, the lack of infrastructure, but efforts are still being made by the government to promote battery manufacturing and to go past these roadblocks as per the minister. Now, just to give you a brief idea about the present status of electric vehicle in India, are we actually closer to achieving our aim or not? Now, if you actually look at the EV sales in India for year 2020, you would see that globally about 80 lakh EV vehicles were sold in 2020. That is about 2.6% of the global vehicle sales. India is one of those nations where the people are fast embracing the EVs. For example, you see a lot of people opting for electric cars such as Tata Nexon. India is one of those nations that have supported the global EV 30 by 30 campaign, which means that we are trying to ensure that at least 30% of the new vehicle sales is of electric vehicles by the year 2030. So to jump from 1.7% to 30% will require a lot of effort from the side of the Indian government and the Indian people. Now the challenges are, number one, the problem of battery manufacturing. See, the electric vehicles are mainly dependent on the power and the performance of the battery. That decides the life and the quality of electric vehicle. Now, the problem is that these batteries cost a huge amount of money. And this requires a lot of investment and technology from the side of the government because private sector might not be willing to invest that much money. As per the government, India imported more than $1 billion worth of lithium ion cells in 2021. Even though there is not a lot of penetration of electric vehicles in the country, the amount of money that we are still spending on the components is a worrying sign. Then there are consumer related issues. For example, there are lack of charging stations. You still see electric charging stations only in tier 1 cities in India right now. Let's say Delhi, Bangalore, Chennai, Mumbai, and some very well-known highways, but you don't really see a lot of these charging stations in tier 2 or tier 3 cities. Even if there are charging stations, it is not like a petrol or diesel vehicle. For example, you're going on a highway and you notice that you're out of petrol, you can just stop at a petrol pump and get your tank filled. But if you see your battery is out of charge, even if you see a charging station and you connect it, you will still have to spend a lot of time for your battery to go up to an appropriate level to continue the journey. So it's not an instant refill kind of a thing. You would have to wait there and make sure that your battery is charging at the same time. That again remains an issue. For example, for a slow charger, it can take up to 12 hours to fully charge the battery at the owner's house, which is still a problem that we have not been able to counter. There's also lack of technology and skilled labor. So for example, if your car breaks down, you know that there's a mechanic on the road and he or she would most probably be able to find the fault. But when it's an electric vehicle with a lot of chips and semiconductors and new technology, you don't know if the same roadside mechanic or technician would be able to find the fault in your car and would be able to rectify that. Then the charging infrastructure is still a concern. Although the Ministry of Power has prescribed at least one charging station to be present in a grid of 3 km and every 25 kilometers on both sides of the highways, but that is still to be implemented. The Ministry of Housing and Urban Affairs, as per the Model Building Bylaws of 2016, mandated that at least 20% of the parking space in the society should be for EV charging facilities. But even then, even when you go to the most well-known residential complexes or societies, there are no charging stations or charging facilities given for EVs right now, even in tier 1 cities. These are the articles we wanted to discuss on the Hindu newspaper today. Now a couple of practice questions. Number 1. Discuss the reasons behind the rise in popularity of electric vehicles in India. Identify the roadblocks that are still inhibiting the sector from achieving its true potential. Second, discuss the salient features of the Rights of Persons with Disability Act 2016. How far has the Act been successful in improving the lives of the people covered under the Act? Both the questions have to be answered within 250 words each. Thank you so much for watching the video.